Well, hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to my review of Crow Country. So I'm going to come out swinging straight away. This is one of the best games I've played all year. I absolutely loved every second of it. I do have a finger on the scale and I'm a bit biased because I'm a bit of a survival horror nut and enthusiast. This is one of the better ones that I've played. It sits in an interesting little niche of baby's first survival horror, I suppose. I don't want to say that it's easy, but it's kind of more compact and more accessible. Just generally, like a bite size makes it sound tiny. It's not, but it's also not like a 20 to 30 hour game that outstays its welcome. So this is really quite wonderful, and I would recommend it to, well, anyone. And if you are in fact a bit cagey for some reason about Resident Evil games and all that, it would be a great stepping in point, a great entry point. So for those not across it, when I do reviews, the only objective metric I do is ask that for every $5 Australian a game asks of me, I ask that it gives me an hour of good, solid gameplay fun. So this is a low bar intentionally, sort of a you have to be this tall to get on this ride value proposition. And this allows me to sort of render judgment and objectively compare games to one another. So it's currently going, well, it's on a sale for launch, but the base price is $29.50 Australian. We'll call it 30 and we'll call that 6 hours. I actually clocked this in about 5.5 hours, and to be honest, I kind of flew through it at a clip. Not that I was just avoiding stuff and mainlining or anything like that, but there is side secret stuff. There is incentive to play through it again for higher ranks, much like the Resident Evil series, and unlockable extra collectible stuff on the end. So there is replayability. Having said that, like I said, I'm a huge Resident Evil nut. I don't really replay for ranks or anything like that. I'll just replay Resident Evil games because I love them so much on their own merit. And this game is probably the same. I would replay it in the future just because I loved it so much. So it sits right on that sort of qualifier of worth your time, worth your money. I would say absolutely it is. The quality of what it did for my time was high and above. But it's not one of those games that you're going to get 1,000 hours of grinding out of. And to be perfectly honest, I'm very much sick of those sort of games where they're designed like that as a principle. Just bloat and waste your time. So I would say this is very clean, very succinct, and it's worth your time, worth your money. So what is it? Well, look, basically, yes, a survival horror. It has that sort of PS1 90s graphical aesthetic. You do have like a free rotational camera around your character, but it is still played out in these sort of room vignettes. So while it throws back to the Resident Evil design of old, it's still not the fixed camera tank controls. You can tank control if you want with D-pad, but the thumbstick works quite well. The weapon aiming system is kind of novel. You hold up and you aim the controls around. It's kind of charmingly clunky, almost intentionally clunky, but it works. And it's a value add, similar to, again, the comparisons to Resident Evil are going to be many, but the idea of having to stand still, ready up your gun and fire, and it takes that into a more 3D space than what you would have been used to in the previous games. So you've got up and down and you can aim to try and get headshots and that sort of stuff. So it's set in the 90s. You're following this chick Mara. There's a lot of mystery, and I don't want to ruin the story because the story is actually really quite strong and mystery driven, which is the best way to do story. A lot of shit written these days, it focuses too much on interpersonal drama, how this person feels about me, that sort of stuff. This is all about the mystery behind this theme park called Crow Country, run by Edward Crow, the head of this Crow family, and that's about as much as I really want to say. The place is shut down, so it's sort of an abandoned amusement park. I guess it's kind of tapping that modern wave of horror, of animatronic horror. I guess that's for a younger generation than me. You know, your Five Nights at Freddy's and all that. And I'm not trying to be prudish. I've never really given Five Nights at Freddy's a go. But by that same token, animatronic horror as a concept really doesn't appeal to me. I feel like it might be a generational thing. Having said that, I really, really enjoyed this, so maybe I need to go back and bite the bullet and play things like Five Nights at Freddy's. So yeah, shut down amusement park, big mystery behind it, a lot of twists and turns for such a short runtime of 5.5 hours. Having said that, I think most people would probably take longer. I consumed this, I hoovered it, and I am someone that plays pretty much all survival horror games coming out. So if you are similar to me in that space where you could call yourself a bit of a sweat, a bit of a veteran when it comes to these games, you probably already bought this having seen my video or knowing about it and hoovered it up. So this video, in a way, isn't really pitched at you. For those that may be a little bit more apprehensive, you will get your value out of it because you probably won't fly through it as quick as me. A couple of things probably worth mentioning is the difficulty's kind of spot on. I would argue that in comparison to the staples like Resident Evil, the item management isn't quite as stressful. It's a little bit more, well, like I said, kind of baby's first survival horror, and that's not a disparagement. This is a mark of honor because not a lot of games do that on ramping. And I can only assume I'm inside the bubble. But if you don't know anything about Resident Evil, you're probably overwhelmed by there being 10,000 games and all that. And I could see it being scary for someone coming in that's never tried it. Spoiler, just start with Resident Evil 1 and we'll go through it. It's not that bad. But it also kind of occurs to me that survival horror games are, generally speaking, they're made for survival horror fans. There's not a lot of real good entry-level stuff. Even things like Signalis, that game was brilliant. But I could see that if that was your first survival horror, that you might have a hard time getting into it. So this is one of the, in the future, if someone asks me what survival horror would you recommend as like a first game, this would probably be it, to be honest. It's so very clean in the backwards and forwards puzzling. It's not terribly scary. And I've talked about this ad nauseum. I think horror as a trapping, as a setting is part of survival horror. But a game that intentionally tries to scare you and terrify you is working against itself. The Resident Evil games, broadly speaking, aren't very scary. They just happen to be set in a scary environment. So, you know, zombies and viruses and all this sort of stuff. But it's more compelling than it is trying to make you put the control down out of like bloody abject horror. And that's a totally different genre. I'm not necessarily getting into it. Things like Outlast are a great example, where they're less of a survival horror game and more of a terrifying simulator trying to, you know, challenge the player to man up and push through. It's a different thing. It's a different type of horror, I would argue. Anyway, so this game has horror elements for sure, and it has probably some of the best jump scares I've ever seen. There's only a few, and they were so clever, and I'm not going to wreck them. As someone who hates jump scares, I can think of 2 or maybe 3 moments where this game jump scared, and I would say they were good, which is high praise. I don't think I've ever said a jump scare is good, but I kind of laughed at the moment. I can think of one especially on the top of my mind. I had a belly chuckle, nervous jump scare laugh, you know the type, because it was kind of like, wow, that actually got me, and that was really good. So that was really unusual. But again, not before I lose the thread, the horror component is more about creating a great thriller setting. And from that, you get a compelling story, and that works here as well. The real heart and soul of a survival horror, the more and more I play them over the years, is the Metroidvania adjacent back and forward exploration puzzling that they do. And this does it really well. You know, you're mostly collecting like keys, gold, silver, bronze, and I don't want to wreck any of the puzzles, but you know, they're all fairly entry level, right? They're not going to melt your brain, but you are going to get your little dopamine hit as well. So the game's not necessarily on super easy mode. I got stumped a couple of times, and it even has things like there's like a fortune teller machine that you can go up to, and you've got 10 credits to try that, and it'll give you a hint as to where you're supposed to go next. Again, this is just a wonderful feature. It saves you having to tab out and look up a guide when you get stumped. And again, I'm so biased, it's hard to even remember the first time I played like a Resident Evil or whatever, but that probably happened in some of, especially the older ones, which were way more puzzly designed. I probably did get stuck and had to go sniffing around for answers. And I used the clue system in this a couple of times, half out of curiosity, but also, you know, when you're getting into the end game and you've explored most of the map and you're not 100% sure where this key goes or whatever, it wasn't really that big a deal to just ask the machine. And at first it will just give you a very broad cryptic clue, which is kind of good enough, but if you drill it again, it will explicitly spell out where to go. And I kind of actually appreciate that, and I would love to see more games like that. There is probably a whole theory that you could talk about, and it's beyond the scope of the video, but to brush on. As soon as you have a game that requires you to tab out and hit a Wikipedia for any reason, I feel like that in some ways could be a fail condition against the game. You want to keep the player's attention solely on the game and never ever have them tab out ever. So having like an internalized guide system is very, very clever. Anyway, so look, it's all fairly light on as far as squeezing you and difficulty and that sort of stuff. But that no less changes the fact that it's a really compelling story. The art style is so wonderful. The fundamentals are really, really solid. Did I mention the soundtrack? The soundtrack is actually really cool and appropriate and has a bit of a nostalgia to it as well. And even like there's a big finale, the descent to the finale, and you're going down a ladder and it's playing a great track. And so it has its cinematic punches as well. Anyway, I'm gushing because this game's worth it. As I said and led with at the beginning, it's one of the best games I've played this year, and I would suggest it and recommend it to literally anyone, whether you are a fan or you are fair weather and maybe a little bit standoffish for survival horror. What a wonderful game, and a weekend I won't soon forget. Anyway, team, let me know what you reckon if you're going to get it yourself. I mean, you should. Otherwise, might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.